So Catherine, Princess of Wales, just took Camilla's seat in the state opening of Parliament procession, and the story behind how that happened is way more intense than anything you saw on camera. Because on the surface, it looks like a seating chart change. Someone got moved up, someone got moved back, palace logistics, whatever. But when you actually look at what was said versus what happened, this wasn't a schedule update. This was the final move in a private war that had been burning behind closed doors for months. And honestly, the fact that it stayed quiet this long is kind of wild. Before we get into all of it, make sure to subscribe to Crown Watch so you don't miss these breakdowns. All right, let's get into this. So the state opening of Parliament is one of those events where literally nothing is accidental. Every carriage, every entrance, the walking order, who sits where, it all carries a message about rank, about trust, and about where the monarchy is heading. So when the revised procession cards went out for this week's ceremony, and Catherine's name was sitting beside William's in the senior formation where Camilla's had been for, everyone who saw that document knew exactly what they were looking at. Catherine apparently placed her hand over William's and asked whether Charles understood what the country would read into the change. William told her his father had approved it. But approval and being ready for the consequences are two completely different things, and that's where the story really starts. In another room, Camilla received the same schedule. She read Catherine's name twice. Her expression tightened as the meaning settled, and she asked the equerry whether the instruction came directly from Charles. He confirmed the monarch signed it after a late-night review of ceremonial duties. No explanation was attached. Just 4 words beside the amendment: future continuity and active representation. Camilla removed her glasses, closed the folder, and whispered, "Then everyone will know." The aide stayed silent because he understood the palace would read the signal before the first carriage even moved. Charles hadn't framed this as a temporary answer to illness or fatigue or scheduling pressure. A documented palace account described Catherine's place as the preferred formation for future state processions involving William. That word, preferred, changed everything because it suggested permanence. The Waleses were no longer being positioned as supporting figures. They were being presented as the bridge between the current reign and the next. For Catherine, that brought responsibility without any sense of triumph. For Camilla, it felt like recognition being withdrawn while she was still standing right beside the king. William sensed the danger immediately. He knew the revised order strengthened Catherine's position, but he also knew it exposed the fracture between the households. Behind that careful wording sat a private dispute involving all 4 of them. A confrontation over duty, loyalty, and who truly represents the monarchy's next chapter. The altered procession wasn't just a change of seats. It was the final move in a deeply personal struggle between 4 royals who understood that position, visibility, and survival had suddenly become the same thing. To the public, the procession lasts only minutes. For Catherine, Camilla, William, and Charles, those minutes carry decades of sacrifice, resentment, and unfinished history. Each of them entered that ceremony with something different to protect. One wants stability, one wants recognition. One wants the future defended, and one aging monarch has to decide which woman the crown can no longer afford to place at its center. Catherine felt no victory in the change. She understood that her new position would be read as an elevation, but she feared the moment would look like triumph over another woman. The crown, meaning the monarchy as an institution, not just a piece of jewelry, depends on unity because public confidence weakens, the second family tension becomes visible. She wanted to protect William, not deepen a wound that could follow him into the next reign. William watched her push breakfast aside the morning the schedule arrived. He told her she shouldn't apologize for accepting the duty Charles had requested. Catherine answered that accepting responsibility was easy. Carrying another person's humiliation was not. He reminded her that she had already become one of the monarchy's strongest public anchors, and that mattered because the institution needed stability now, not only after he became king. She looked at him carefully and asked whether strength always had to cost someone else. Camilla carried a completely different fear. In a private recorded conversation later documented by her sister Annabelle, the Queen Consort admitted she could survive criticism from newspapers, but not being visibly replaced while her husband still reigned. Ceremonial placement had become proof that years of loyalty and endurance had finally been recognized. Losing it felt like the palace was rewriting her value in public. Annabelle tried to reassure her, but Camilla refused comfort. She said Catherine feared the seat might divide the family, while she feared losing it proved the division had already been decided. That contrast cuts deeper than anger. One woman saw danger in gaining the place. The other saw judgment in surrendering it. Charles carried both burdens. The king knew the future increasingly depended on the Prince and Princess of Wales. Yet he also knew Camilla had remained beside him through years of hostility. He walked past the planning room that afternoon, heard courtiers speaking both women's names, and stopped. For one long moment, the monarch listened. Then he continued down the corridor without entering, choosing silence because every answer seemed to betray someone. But silence couldn't erase history. And when the palace looked back for the moment this ceremonial battle truly began, every memory returned to one private reception where a single instruction transformed tension into open resistance. The procession crisis began months earlier, not inside Parliament, but at a private diplomatic reception at Windsor Castle. That evening, an instruction was issued before the guests arrived. It sounded procedural. It lasted less than a minute. Yet William heard it, Catherine absorbed it, and Charles failed to reverse it. From that moment onward, the question was no longer whether the family was divided, but when the division would become publicly visible. Palace planners had already begun pressing for change. They wanted William and Catherine placed closer to Charles at major engagements because foreign guests responded to them. Younger audiences followed them, and the monarchy needed a visible bridge between the present reign and the next. The Lord Chamberlain, the senior official who organizes major royal ceremonies, received those recommendations in writing. Camilla saw something more dangerous. To the Queen Consort, every step forward for the Waleses made the king's own reign look smaller. So she acted before the Windsor reception began. She instructed the Lord Chamberlain to move Catherine 2 positions farther from Charles in the receiving line, which is the formal row where royals greet invited guests, one by one. Her words were precise. The Queen Consort's place must remain visibly unmistakable. The order took seconds. Its damage lasted far longer. Catherine learned of the change moments before entering. She adjusted her gloves, steadied her voice, and told the courtier she would stand wherever duty required. William saw what others missed. The princess did not protest, but the hurt reached her eyes before she hid it. He carried that image through the entire evening. William confronted Charles after the final guest departed. The prince asked why his wife had been moved without consultation. The king avoided the heart of the question, warning that ceremonial order must never become a family argument. William answered that it became one the moment Catherine was treated as a threat instead of the future queen. Then he set down his glass and left before dessert. That exit changed the palace record. A confidential planning memorandum, basically an internal document used to guide future decisions, was written after the confrontation. It demanded clear generational continuity at state ceremonies and blocked last-minute changes from separate royal households. Camilla later read a documented account showing that the Windsor reception had been cited as evidence of damaging interference. She felt exposed, not merely opposed. The memory returned when the state opening plan reached its final stage. Camilla demanded that Charles reject the recommendation, and William was summoned to hear her challenge face to face. What followed was not a discussion between distant royal households, but a closed-door confrontation where every restrained grievance finally entered the room at once. There were no cameras, no advisors, and no carefully prepared statements when the four of them met. Charles sat at the head of the table. Camilla arrived carrying the revised order. William entered without removing his coat. Catherine came last and closed the door herself. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then the Queen Consort placed the procession card before the king and said the sentence that shattered every remaining pretense of unity. Camilla leaned toward Charles. "That place is mine," she said, insisting that removing her from the central formation while she remained Queen Consort would weaken the authority of his reign. The title means the sovereign's wife, a role without the monarch's constitutional power, but with enormous public weight. She argued that millions would read the change as rejection, not adjustment. The king listened, but his silence only sharpened her anger. William answered before his father could The prince said the state opening could not be arranged around protecting personal pride. Parliament needed to see continuity beside the sovereign, and Catherine had already been asked to carry a wider constitutional role. That role means public duties supporting the crown and preparing for the next reign. He insisted she could no longer be treated as decorative when the institution increasingly depended on her steadiness. Catherine remained quiet until Camilla accused the Wales household of pushing for the change. The princess lifted her eyes and said she had neither requested the seat nor intended to use it against anyone. The queen consort replied that accepting it was still a choice. Catherine's expression changed. Refusing a direct duty from Charles would also be a choice, she said, and the consequences would fall on William, the monarchy, and every future appearance they made together. Charles raised his hand. The king reminded them that the procession existed to support Parliament, not display a family war. William challenged him immediately. If the symbolism didn't matter, why had he approved the new order? The monarch admitted he signed it because reduced engagements and public concern had made continuity impossible to hide. The country needed to see who could carry the crown next. Camilla turned toward her husband. She asked whether Catherine had become more necessary than she was. Charles did not answer. That silence struck harder than any confession. Camilla pushed back her chair and left the planning card behind. Catherine stared at the handwritten approval beside her name, knowing the decision carried another protection Charles had not designed. Camilla believed the king's signature had taken her place away, but the deeper truth was more unsettling. The machinery of the monarchy had already moved beyond the power of one wounded conversation. The procession card appeared to carry Charles's decision alone. In reality, it had passed through a chain of officials who had spent weeks preparing for resistance. Every position had been reviewed, every constitutional signal had been debated. And hidden inside the final schedule was a safeguard designed to prevent any household from changing the formation at the last moment. The decisive force was not anger. It was preparation. Sir Michael Harcourt carried the sealed order into the king's study. The senior ceremonial advisor, the official responsible for coordinating royal appearances and formal precedents, had spent weeks working with the Lord Chamberlain's office, constitutional advisors, and William's private secretary. Together, they reviewed every carriage, entrance, and seat to show both the reigning sovereign and the direct line of succession. Their conclusion was blunt. Catherine, beside William, gave the country a clearer image of continuity. Charles read the document twice. The king pressed his thumb against the margin beside Camilla's former position, then looked at Sir Michael without speaking. The advisor explained that another change would disrupt security routes, transport timings, and coordination with Parliament. More importantly, it would make the monarchy appear uncertain at the exact moment it needed calm. Camilla would still arrive with dignity and hold a prominent place inside the chamber, but the central procession would now frame the future. Charles lifted the pen and hesitated. Sir Michael noticed the pause before the monarch signed. A restriction inside the order stated that no individual household could alter the formation after final sovereign approval. The clause, basically a binding instruction within the schedule, stopped Camilla's staff from restoring her former place through private calls or late pressure. Once the signature dried, the plan was locked. William received the news through a documented briefing from his private secretary. The prince showed no satisfaction. He asked whether his father understood how isolated Camilla would feel when millions saw the change. Sir Michael answered with painful precision. The palace could protect dignity, but it could not conceal succession. That mattered because hiding the future made the institution look afraid, while exposing family rivalry made it look divided. William lowered his eyes to the confidential note attached to the order. It stated that Catherine's placement reflected active support for the sovereign and public stability for the next reign, not marital competition. The words sounded measured, but their meaning was devastating. The institution had finally said aloud what the family had avoided admitting. Within hours, Camilla's household began quietly withdrawing from scheduled rehearsals. The decision was now protected by protocol, but protocol could not control the human reaction. And behind Camilla's closed door, shock was rapidly hardening into refusal. The first consequence didn't arrive through an official announcement. It came when Camilla's senior dresser informed the rehearsal team that the queen consort would not attend the afternoon procession walkthrough. Within minutes, Aides began exchanging calls. Car arrangements were paused, and Charles was told that his wife had locked herself inside her private sitting room. The ceremonial change had become something painfully human, a woman confronting the possibility that the palace no longer needed her at its center. Camilla canceled the first full rehearsal and sent word that she would discuss the separate arrival only after speaking with Charles. The walk through the practice run used to test timing, movement, and security continued with an empty marker where she should have stood. Officials kept working, but the gap carried its own message. The family conflict was no longer hidden inside paperwork. It was interrupting the ceremony itself, threatening delays that would expose disorder before Parliament and weaken the calm image the crown depends on. Camilla sat alone and removed the brooch chosen for the state opening. She placed it back in its case before answering Annabelle's call. In that private conversation, later preserved in her sister's documented account, the Queen Consort admitted that she felt displayed as a chapter the monarchy wanted to close. Annabelle told her the seat could not erase everything she had endured. Camilla answered that public symbols often outlived private explanations, especially when millions watched one brief moment and remembered it for years. Charles entered without aides. The king listened as his wife asked whether he would have accepted being moved aside while his mother still reigned. He said he had spent much of his life waiting outside the center. Camilla looked away. The comparison didn't comfort her. It made the loss feel like a lesson he believed she should endure. Catherine received the cancellation with immediate guilt. The princess offered to withdraw if her presence threatened the ceremony, but William refused. The prince told her retreat would turn duty into guilt and reward pressure behind closed doors. Palace staff quietly chose emotional sides. Some saw Camilla's humiliation. Others remembered how often Catherine had absorbed unfair treatment without complaint. Charles ordered the rehearsal to continue exactly as approved. His voice remained steady until the secretary left. Then the monarch sat alone and covered his face with both hands. Camilla eventually agreed to attend under the revised arrangement, but she refused to rehearse beside Catherine. For the first time since the crisis began, the next move would not belong to the king or the palace. It would belong to Catherine, entering a room where rank offered no protection to either woman. Catherine did not arrive with a secretary, a schedule, or a message from William. She entered Camilla's sitting room alone and closed the door behind her. The two women had appeared together at ceremonies, dinners, and memorials, always protected by rehearsed smiles and public distance. Now, there was no institution between them, only the seat, the procession, and the painful truth that one woman represented the present while the other had become impossible to separate from the future. Catherine spoke first. The princess said she had not come to defend the palace order. She had come because she refused to let the state opening become an image of one woman defeating another. The ceremony matters because millions read its seating and movement as a statement of rank. It also matters because one cruel headline can turn private pain into permanent public history. Camilla did not soften. The Queen Consort said the victory had already been arranged. Once the country saw Catherine beside William, every newspaper would call her displaced. She had spent years surviving judgment to stand beside Charles, and now the palace seemed ready to move her aside before his reign had even ended. Catherine accepted that the headlines would be brutal. She reminded Camilla that she too had spent years being compared, judged, and presented as though every appearance were a contest she had entered willingly. The princess said she would accept duties connected to William's future role, but she would never ask Charles to erase his wife's dignity. Camilla finally revealed her deepest fear through the private conversation, later recorded in a household account. She was terrified of becoming invisible while still standing beside the king. Catherine sat opposite her and answered that visibility could not create permanence. History remembered how people behaved when the center shifted. For the first time, neither woman spoke as a rival or symbol alone. Catherine then offered something practical. After the procession, she would pause at the parliamentary entrance, so Charles and Camilla entered before the Waleses, preserving formal precedence, the official order showing who goes first. The gesture would not return the seat, but it would prevent the Queen Consort from appearing discarded. Camilla removed the cancellation from her rehearsal schedule. Before Catherine left, she asked whether William had sent her. The princess answered, "No, I came because one day I may sit where you sit, and I will remember how this felt." That private conversation ended the rebellion inside the palace, but outside its walls, the world was waiting to interpret every step, every glance, and the unmistakable seat Catherine now occupied. By sunrise, crowds had already gathered behind the barriers near Buckingham Palace and along the procession route. They came expecting tradition. What they witnessed was transition. When Catherine appeared in the central formation beside William, the reaction moved through the crowd like a sudden wave. Phones rose, commentators stopped speaking for a fraction too long, and in that brief silence, millions understood that the monarchy had shown them its future without issuing a single direct announcement. Catherine held her expression steady as the procession began. The princess occupied the place beside William while Camilla traveled with Charles under the revised arrangement. Formal precedence still belonged to the king and queen consort at Parliament. That mattered because the ceremony could recognize the future without stripping dignity from the present. It also mattered because one misplaced step could turn a planned transition into a public humiliation. William turned toward Catherine before the carriage moved. The prince gave a small nod, not of celebration but reassurance. She understood the weight immediately. Camilla remained composed beside Charles, yet the queen consort watched carefully as they approached the entrance. Then Catherine slowed exactly as promised. The princess stepped back, allowing the monarch and his wife to enter before the Waleses. The public reaction changed in seconds. The Daily Chronicle published an afternoon front page showing Catherine beside William beneath the headline, "The Future Takes Its Place." A BBC broadcaster, speaking during the live ceremonial coverage, called it the clearest ceremonial recognition yet that the Waleses now carry the monarchy's next chapter, while also noting Camilla's dignified entrance beside the sovereign. Outside Buckingham Palace, one elderly woman raised a photograph of Queen Elizabeth II as Catherine's carriage passed. She said she would understand what that seat means. The crowd around her began applauding. Online debate had first centered on Camilla being replaced, but the image of Catherine pausing changed the story completely. What looked like defeat became managed transition. What could have seemed cruel became controlled. Charles watched the replay that evening. The king saw Catherine step back, saw Camilla move forward, and finally understood the full meaning of the gesture. He turned to his private secretary and said, "She protected all of us." Behind the palace gates, aides stopped calling the arrangement a compromise. They called it a settlement. William had gained recognition. Catherine had shown restraint. Camilla had kept precedence, and Charles had avoided a public fracture. Yet one final judgment still remained. The nation had already reached its conclusion, but the deepest verdict would come inside the palace when Charles finally named what Catherine's place in the procession had truly represented. That evening, the procession cards were collected, the ceremonial uniforms were removed, and the palace corridors grew quiet again. Yet nobody believed the day could simply be filed away as another state opening. Catherine had taken Camilla's former seat, but she had refused to turn the moment into revenge. The change had exposed a painful truth, tested a marriage, challenged a future king, and forced the monarchy to decide whether continuity could be acknowledged without cruelty. Charles gathered William, Catherine, and Camilla in the room where the confrontation had begun. The revised procession card rested at the center of the table, but nobody reached for it. The king explained that the placement had never been designed to remove his wife from the reign. It recognized that the Prince and Princess of Wales now carried responsibilities that could not remain hidden until the next accession, the moment a new sovereign formally takes the throne. Charles turned toward Camilla. He admitted that his silence during their earlier confrontation had caused more pain than the schedule itself. The monarch had allowed ceremonial uncertainty to become personal conflict, and that mattered because silence inside a royal family often looks like judgment outside it. His wife listened without interruption. When he finished, the queen consort accepted that the future could not be delayed simply to protect her position. Camilla asked for one thing. She wanted future changes discussed honestly, not delivered as completed decisions. Catherine answered that she would accept every duty required of her, but she would not help create public humiliation for another family member. William looked at her with pride. The future king understood that she had secured authority through restraint, not triumph. Charles confirmed that the new formation would remain the preferred arrangement for future state openings involving the Waleses. The decision was final. It was no longer a temporary exception or hidden experiment. Camilla lifted the card, studied Catherine's name, and placed it down without anger. "Then carry it well," she said. The princess answered, "I will carry it carefully." The verdict was unmistakable. Catherine had not taken the seat because Camilla had become worthless. She had taken it because the monarchy's future could no longer remain one step behind its present. Charles remains sovereign. His wife remains beside him. But William and Catherine are now recognized as the pair who must sustain what comes next. Catherine entered the procession as the woman taking Camilla's seat, but she left it as something far more consequential, the recognized guardian of the monarchy's next chapter.